Hi, Rama. It's week 28, day 3 of our Bible narrative reading plan, and today we're in 2 Kings chapter 8. There's a lot going on in this chapter, but we begin right out of the gate with a bit of a problem, so to speak, or at least a question. When did the events of these first 6 verses take place? We're reintroduced to the Shunammite woman that we saw just a few chapters earlier. Elisha healed her son and was involved in her life. We read all those stories there in a few previous chapters, and now she pops up again. So the question is, did these verses that we find after chapter 7 happen chronologically after chapter 7, or did the editor, the compiler, the author of this book include it here for a reason? So I want to be careful and make sure that I'm not misunderstood on what I'm saying here. We know that this text is inspired. All of God's word is perfect. We understand that books are written in different ways, and so the Gospels are written in a different manner than, say, the books of Kings and Chronicles. And it's very clear when you read the books of Kings and Chronicles that they are using other books, because they say, here's a summary of the life of King so-and-so, and you have read of his acts in another book, the book of so-and-so. And so it's pretty straightforward that they're writing a history book. If you put it in our terms today, they're writing a history book and they're using other sources to put all of that together, but with the difference being that this is the Bible, and so it is clearly inspired. And so that this is not an error or a mistake, but it's probably counterintuitive to what you might think at first. We typically think, okay, these verses, what we call chapter 8, comes after chapter 7. Again, knowing that the chapter divisions and the verse divisions are added many centuries later. But we think, well, this is told after chapter 7. And so we just assume that chronologically it happened after chapter 7. But that seems to pose a problem, because we have Gehazi here, the servant of Elisha. And remember, Gehazi is the one who chased after Naaman had been healed of his leprosy, and Gehazi tried to scam him, and he wound up with leprosy himself. And so this text has Gehazi in the presence of the king. And if you had leprosy, you would not be in the presence of the king. And so there's a few other things like that in these verses that lead us to think that chronologically this happened before the events of chapter 7. But it's included here to tie together what happened with the famine. I hope all that makes sense. If not, feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about it more. Again, as I say, this is not a problem in the text. This is us just trying to understand what the author of the book is trying to do by telling us this story and including it here. But regardless of when it happens, we see that the Shunammite woman appears again. Gehazi tells the king about the acts of Elisha, and this is the 7th year of the famine. She's fled to the land of the Philistines, because that's what Elisha warned her to do. And so the king, it's the 7th year, and the king typically restored land during that time, the 7-year restoration. And so we see in verse 6 that not only does he restore all that was hers, because she had land when she left, and now she doesn't. She's been gone. Someone seems to have taken the land. Perhaps it was the king himself. Remember, his mom and dad were Ahab and Jezebel. They were known for taking land that didn't belong to them. And so, however she lost the land, the king restores the land and gives her more, the produce of the fields from the day she left until now. So he's quite generous, whether it's because it's the year of restoration or whatever is going on. That's what's happening in those verses, and that's just the first 6 verses of the chapter. But then now we move on in verses 7 through 15. And again, notice that Elijah is mentioned specifically, and now Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, whom we've seen, he's mentioned again. And the king of Syria is sick. And so the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, says, tell the man of God to come here. He tell Elisha to come here and take a present to meet him on the way. And he tries to really make it a generous gift, thinking, I guess, that if the king makes a really generous gift to the prophet, then the prophet will predict a good outcome. That seems to be what Ben-Hadad is expecting here with this gift. And notice that he sends his messenger, Hazael, to go and meet Elisha. And Hazael asks him, the king of Syria wants to know, am I going to recover from this sickness? And look at chapter 8, verse 10 very carefully. It says, Elisha said to him, go say to him, you shall certainly recover, but the Lord has shown me that he shall certainly die. Now, if you're like me, at first glance, you might think, it sounds like Elisha's lying right here. But after a little further study, number one, the Hebrew is a little difficult to understand what's going on here. But it seems to be that he's saying you will recover from this illness, but the Lord has shown me that you are going to die. Well, now on one hand, that seems obvious because we know that we're all going to die. But it seems like, again, Elisha is predicting that something's going on here, that he will recover from this illness, but yet he's going to have a different untimely death. And then verse 11 says something very interesting, and he fixed his gaze and stared at him until he was embarrassed. Now we have a lot of pronouns of the he's and the hims, and those pronouns are not part of Hebrew. That's part of our English translation. So again, it's difficult to know what's going on, but it seems to be that Elisha is staring at Hazael, the messenger of the king of Syria, and he's staring at him and staring at him and staring at him. And then we begin to realize something strange is going on. He fixed his gaze upon him until it seems that Hazael is embarrassed. And it says, the man of God, Elisha, weeps. And Hazael says, why do you weep? Why does my Lord weep? He answered, because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel. And you can keep reading what Elisha says. So here's what's happening. Elisha, because of God's prophetic visions, he sees that Hazael is actually going to kill Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. So he's saying the king of Syria would recover, but he's going to die. And he keeps staring at him until he makes it clear, I know, God has shown me that you're going to kill him. And Hazael tries to play this off and say, oh, no, I would not do that. But Elisha knows that this is true. And then we read the verse 15, and that's what happens. Hazael goes to the king, and it says he takes the bedcloth. That's what the ESV that I'm reading from says. Whatever this piece of linen is, he dips it in water, and it says he spread it over his face. He smothers him. He suffocates him. He murders the king of Syria, and Hazael becomes king in his place, just as Elisha has predicted, because God has shown it to him that he will be king. Now, as if that's not enough going on just here in chapter 8, we see that there's a king in Judah named Jehoram. But wait a minute, there's a king in the northern kingdom of Israel also named Jehoram. It gets really complicated here. What's interesting about this really is that as these two kingdoms both continue to reject the Lord their God, Judah has had some good kings, you remember that? But now they continually get worse and worse and worse, and they begin to look more and more and more like the northern kingdom, who has never had a good king. And so as these two kingdoms grow to look more and more like one another, they actually have two kings with the same name. And we see that these kings do not walk in the way of the Lord. They do evil in the sight of God. And again, you see recognized here in verse 22 are now the rest of the acts of Joram, or Jehoram, same name, but pronounced differently, different versions. And all that he did, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So again, the author of Kings is referencing the book of Chronicles. So we know that they're working together. They're using history books in the same way that someone writing a history book today would rely on other sources. That's what's happening here. But we have an inspired, complete, authoritative word. And so then we get to the end of the chapters. If we haven't seen enough in chapter 8, then we see that there's a new king in Judah. Most of our attention the last several chapters have been on the northern kingdom of Israel. The focus has shifted back to the southern kingdom of Judah. Again, they've had a king with the same name, Jehoram, and now it tells us that a new king, Ahaziah, begins to reign. But what is the verdict about him? Verse 27, he also walked in the way of Ahab and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, as the house of Ahab had done, for he was son-in-law in the house of Ahab. And so this continues to go on and on and on. Both nations, the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, they're all rejecting the Lord their God. There's a lot that's happened in this chapter. Here's a brief summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.